All right. I forget that you can't see people. It's so strange. Well, let me move this up. Oh, well, it's just us right now. Folks aren't here yet.
We have Melissa is here, and one of our fellows, Joseph Morales, is here.
Oh, nice. Oh, I'm looking in the wrong place. Great. Okay. Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Got it. All right. Well, because I feel like we're going to do a lot of sharing of just some back information of the bylaws. So I'm going to go ahead and let us get started, and folks can trickle in when they have the time to, or when they're ready to. So we're going to start with some introductions, but I guess before I start us off, I want to thank the two of you so far and everyone else who logs on later, for joining us for this, what I'm hoping will be more of a conversation than kind of a presentation, but it's more just to share, the new bylaws and things like that. But thanks for taking some time to spend some time with us and to kind of get a little bit more information about this as members. I am Sunny Klaczystriligi. I am the board president for IJA, at least for another less than a month, maybe. And we've got some of our staff here from IJA as well, who have been very instrumental in putting this together, not just the webinar itself, but also helping out in getting the bylaws together. And then my co-pilot from the Governance and Elections Committee, which is where this is coming from, the work for this is coming from, is Angel Ellis, who I will let introduce herself.
Hello, I'm Angel. I'm VP right now for a little bit longer, I guess. And I'm running into my end of my board term. I got one more year left. And I'm director at Muskogee Media, 17 years journalism, snoring details, but Citizen Muskogee Nation, and so excited about the bylaws. A little bit of a civics nerd, I guess, in that sense. But policy, bylaws, things like that. Good stuff. That's about it.
Great, thank you, Angel. I forgot to ask, but are we able to share screen on this one or in this webinar format?
I think you should have screen sharing abilities, Sunny, so we can
Great.
hook you up with that if you need.
Yes, please. I would actually like to share this little agenda we threw together just to kind of help folks see. And if staff, if you could also share this in the chat so that the links that are up here as we go through them, that would be great. So let me share my screen here so we can just kind of, this is how we envisioned kind of sharing some of this information. Essentially, we put the bylaws in the way that they were, I guess, created and have progressed. So that's kind of what you see in this document, starting with the NAJA charter. And I'm just going to give a quick overview of that. Of course, members were sent this before, I think a couple weeks ago, I want to say. So you all should have access to this, and it's on our website, of course, IJA's website. So this is what the charter looked like. As you can see, it was very kind of overarching and specific for the needs at the time, in the, what is this? The 80s, was it? I forget, 70s. Yeah, so it's only a couple of pages, but it's got kind of the overarching point of the organization, the structure. So this was essentially what we and other boards have built off of, or built onto, if you will. And so it's only like 8 pages here. And then, of course, it was revisited here again in 1995, which was about 31 years ago. And so that became a little bit more specific, if you will. So you'll see a lot more fleshed out language in what were the bylaws at the time, And so, again, this is more accurate, I think, for the time, if you will. In the 90s, I think we can all agree that this is a much different time than 1995 when they passed this, and kind of what the climate was, what the organization looks like. And so once again, taking in consideration the charter and then taking these bylaws and policy into consideration, building off of that, and then kind of mixing it in with kind of what we see, what this organization and its members need. So all is to say that really those two previous bylaws or policies and the charter were influential into what this would look like, the current revised bylaws. So, which is what we have here. And it's a lot longer, of course. So this is what you all will have seen, that we will be voting on or asking members to vote on. So a lot more specifics in there, things that we've learned or the boards have learned over time that have been missing and that are appropriate. I think everything down to, what our tax status is, down to revising the purpose, down to revising the kind of what the board structure looks like. So all of the kind of nitty gritty stuff has been revisited. And then, of course, the name change is also, I think, reflected in this as well, because that's a new thing, one of the newer things, if you will. But please, anyone else who's on this can chime in at any point if there's something I'm missing, because this, of course, is, and something I'll mention later, but this is not just the work of this specific team and this specific board. This is decades back of revising that's been happening. And so I welcome anyone who's been working and are part of that previous boards to chime in at any point. But I just wanted to give a brief kind of overview of like what that process was like and how we've kind of worked through this. And let me stop sharing, whoops, so I can see if there's any, it looks like there might be some questions maybe. Oh, it's just the chatter with the staff. Okay. So let's see if y'all have any questions along the way. I think there's an option to drop them in there. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong, of course, but I'll continue just to share my screen with the agenda as we talk through this so that you all can kind of see what we're referring to. Unless that becomes an issue of some sort, just let me know. So just kind of moving right along, we wanted to share a little bit about the process, if you will. You heard me mention like this has been a long time. 1995 was the last time that these were revised. That's again a long time ago, and there have been a number of factors that have led to kind of why has it taken it that long, or why has this revision taken that long? And it's really due to things like, if you're familiar with our board setup, one, it is a board that typically members only serve 3 years. And Angel and I were both in our last year. No, I'm in my last year and she's about to be in her last year. And it just goes by so fast. And the last year alone and trying to work on this, it just flew by. So I think that's a factor to consider. Another one is this is a working board, which means that it's very much board members are very much on hand or are hands-on in this process, and that can take a lot of time for something that's a voluntary thing. All board members who serve on the board are voluntary, or they serve as volunteers, and so they're putting in that time and effort as volunteers. And then I think another one is just it would be great, and I think maybe the process would move a little bit more swiftly if there were more member engagement, because right now, I mean, I can tell you in the last year, it's really just been IJA staff and board working on the final parts of these bylaws. But, if we had more members who, were willing to take a look into it or to just kind of help, I think that could help with the process a little bit more too. But those are kind of some of the obvious ones that I thought about. I'm not sure about some earlier challenges that kind of contributed to why this has kind of taken as long as it has. I'm actually going to chime in, Rebecca here, to talk a little bit about it, having been here a little bit longer, about any additional reasons that this may have taken so long.
Yeah, thank you, Sunny. And I've been with the organization. This is Rebecca Lansbury Baker, the executive director for IJA, and I have been here on staff since 2013 and serving as executive director. I started as interim in 2015 and then started as ED in 2016. So 10 years as ED, and I was sharing with the committee and with the board throughout this process. We actually started working on these bylaws revisions back when I was on the board before that in 2012. So it has been a really long time that these bylaws have been needing to be revised. And I think given the name change vote and the conversations like leading up to that vote and then now after the vote, is kind of perfect timing now to really have all of the name change woven into the bylaws revisions, as well as some of the older language like the World Wide Web was in there a few times. So there's definitely some 90s language that is uh, really overdue for revising and updating. And so I'm very, very grateful that, again, there's been a couple of different strategic plans, I think at least three, that this has been one of the strategic goals that the board and staff have set. So to see it finally come to a vote is very exciting for the organization. And again, like we've had a lot of changes since the last revision in 1995. So, which still feels like it was only 10 years ago to me, but it was much longer than that. So, yeah, I think it's a great time now with the name change having been approved in 2023, and now we were able to integrate that language and into the new versions. So they're ready to go.
Great, thanks, Rebecca.
Mhm.
I'm gonna not talk for a little bit here and let Angel kind of share something here under the kind of when did the revision process start, and then whatever information is associated with that. As Rebecca mentioned, she had remembered working on it in 2012, and then we had heard others say that it may have started as early as the 2000s, and so again, just a real push to try to get this through since it's been so long. But Angel, looks like you've got a talking point here, so I'll let you go.
Yeah, I definitely was not a part of the 2000s work. I was a graduate in high school, but um just kind of hitting on why that process can take so long. I've been on the board. This is my fifth year. I'm going into my sixth, and that'll be the term limit for me. But I've watched like six or seven people work on it who are already termed off the board now. So, and in that process over that 5 years, people who were hands-on with it are now off the board, and then it hands off to a fresh batch, and you're looking at this like pages of documents and words going, holy shit, what do I do with this? And then we've even had a change in legal we draft these bylaws with the advice and under the advisement of legal counsel. And so in that time frame that I've been on the board, I can also speak to the fact that like our legal counsel kind of changed a little bit. And I look at it now and we have this really uh man, this is an energetic crew and they're just charging through some things. Like this is a part of our strategic planning goal, and I've watched it at least one whole cycle. Not, we didn't meet that goal the first cycle of my term, like it was set as a goal, and then as we revised and looked at our strategic planning, it was like, well, we didn't get that one approved and done. But we've even since this has started, the name of the organization has changed. So it's kind of in this like critical flow that it really needed updating World Wide Web and different things like that. And I've even watched over these years where there were certain things that we would look to the bylaws and say, okay, well, does this current, what we're operating under now allow us to do this thing that members are asking for or wanting to do. And then sometimes the answer was no. And then sometimes, we had things that we were trying to move along and just didn't have a lot of good guidance in those bylaws. And so also along with working through the bylaws, we are part of a really cool group of board members who are building in standard operating procedures frameworks for the board. And so I think this is going to be um, the adoption of these bylaws, I think will allow us as an organization to really key in member advisement much more and on a regular basis into the governing documents of the org. So um, was that my talking point? Did I get off?
Yeah, you went right into the rest of the talking points, which is totally fine.
Segue.
And I want to make sure, yeah, I want to make sure that there's also time for folks to ask questions. So I'm going to just kind of check some of those that you've already discussed, which again is great. I guess something we just wanted to convey before getting into like what the next steps would be, of course, with the after the vote, but because we have some other ideas. Like it doesn't just end here, like, okay, great, we revise it, we get it voted on, hopefully get it passed. It's also what happens after that. So we're already thinking about beyond the vote, beyond implementation. And so one thing to consider is that this is definitely a living document. That's how I've seen this. It's going to need changes over time. What this committee will do once, depending on what happens with the vote, is create some kind of a process or system within the committee the committee that's responsible for getting getting the bylaws revised or revisited or what have you. All of that there currently is not a system or timeline in place for that to happen for the committee or the board to use as reference. So we will be creating that. Perhaps one of my ideas or our ideas is to align that with the strategic plan. Maybe it's a year before the strategic plan, we get this out there again, or we get this out there to members to provide feedback and then spend a couple more months visiting that feedback and maybe implementing it within this committee. Again, there currently is not a system in place for that. In fact, our current bylaws that we're going by, which are the 1995 ones, essentially don't say anything about needing to do that. So us having this Q&A is our way of kind of giving that to members, even though there isn't something in the bylaws that says that's something we have to do. We're just trying to do this in good faith, if you will, and answer any questions that we can about this process, because that is not going to be a part of it this round anyway. So the goal is for this committee to create policy really outlining how do we address these revisions moving forward? How do we make sure that we're not revisiting this in another 30 years or passing another set of revised bylaws in another 30 years? We want to prevent that from happening, essentially. But all of this is really just to get us to that point of getting into the rhythm of making that happen. And so that was what one of the biggest goals was in getting these revised bylaws out, is we have to have a starting point, and that starting point can't continuously be 1995. And so that's really where this work is coming from. So the work is ongoing, and it's really driven by members, and we hope that it continues to be driven by members, because this is a member-centered organization. We want it to continue to be that way, which means that if members took part in the kind of implementation and revision of the bylaws, they're the ones really steering the ship here by creating some of the bylaws, if you will. So, or helping with creating some of those bylaws. Anything else from staff or Angel, something that you think is important to note that I've missed? I've just kind of skipped along to kind of moving forward and then getting into the questions, but jump in, please.
The only other thing I could think to mention is that in 1995, the philanthropic environment was a much safer one for different organizations, and especially diverse organizations. And right now we are in a day and age where diversity organizations are coming under extreme threat for losing their nonprofit status and things like that. And another thing that these proposed bylaws helps us do is shore up language and keep us protected as an organization that is probably one of the few that I know of that does all that it does to support Indigenous journalists. And we cannot, as people who I can personally say that the organization has made such a difference in my life, I cannot in good conscience like leave my term and not have provided the best possible foundation for this org to survive this era. Is really another reason for the urgency and the reason we took our time and looked at these. And now we are seeing, just an atmosphere where nonprofits are under attack every day. So that's something to think about.
Rebecca, is there anything on your end you'd like to share before we jump into the questions, or anything, any other staff, of course, is welcome to share?
No, this is a great overview so far. So again, happy to jump into any questions that attendees may have, or if any other panelists have questions, like this is great. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, questions. We're ready. We could also, if it's relevant, it looks like we've got one attendee, a fellow board member. Melissa, let's hear your interview skills here. Are you rusty, or do you have questions for us? What might other members want to know? I think would be helpful here.
Oh, she's got her hand raised. I think we can allow her to talk.
I did.
There we go. Hi,
Come on in.
Melissa.
Hello.
Hello.
Well, thank you all for making time to share the info, because I do remember a lot of the conversation in earlier years around some of the struggles and challenges of drafting bylaws as the organization was growing. And I do think particularly with our name change, I think you all have heard me talk a little bit about, kind of growing pains, right, of a growing membership. And so maybe can you just share a little bit about how updating the bylaws factors into also, I guess, the mission statement and purpose out of that name change?
Yeah, I think I could speak to this one. This one is one we actually went back and forth with quite a bit with the lawyer, because we had to be very specific about how we, in terms of language. So I'm going to bring it up here. Where is that? There was the statement of purpose that we wanted to revise. Where is it? Sorry, I'm trying to look for it here. Why am I missing it? Well, the statement of purpose initially had very specific language in terms of who this organization serves. And so we did revisit that to make it more, I guess I would say, inclusive, because I think there was mention in the original one of I think there was the obvious students, like working journalists, but even how journalists were described didn't really fit with kind of how folks see themselves as journalists right now. So we had changed it. I want to say something along the lines of, if somebody could bring that up. I'm having a hard time finding it because I'm talking at the same time, but we had changed it to something to the effect of journalists who work with, or I think it was those who work within the journalism ecosystem. That was which was our fantastic wording from Angel Ellis that we threw in there. And that was the one thing that the lawyer did not throw back at us and say, well, this is not going to work. And so we went back and forth quite a bit. And so I'm glad that she workshopped that one. Which made it more inclusive. And one of the things we learned about the bylaws in the process was to be as overarching or to zoom out as much as possible so that it is more applicable. And then some of those kind of minute details could be done with more within committees using policy and things like that. So really understanding, so really the bylaws I think now are more reflected to be more inclusive because we do recognize that there are Native journalists who work in different capacities now. So I think that one might even argue that, there's a more inclusive space now for those who work in academia or those who work in comms now, where a lot of our Indigenous journalists are kind of seeing themselves occupy those types of spaces. And so, who's got the screen? Becca has the screen. Yeah, where did we put that ecosystem?
I think, well, I was looking at the purpose, but at the ecosystem, I'll see if I can find that too.
Yeah.
But I know this is one of the things that we nailed down here for the purpose, but if we're looking for like who is a member, let me see if I can find that for us.
I think it was like something about how like in that definition of what a journalist or like what it is, it's kind of like funny, but like what is the definition of it is,
Yeah.
and there was just one example. There was a really brilliant young woman who works in like strategic communication for a fundraising organization, and she's kind of barred from being on our board, and we kind of would really benefit from that kind of skill set on the board. And it seems really,
Sorry.
ludicrous to kind of lock those people out just because they're not like working in a newsroom proper. So
I
that
just
a
found
lot of
it.
the discussion.
Yeah, so under membership, this is the voting member definition that was changed. So it says there shall be one class of voting members. Members are individuals who are Native American media professionals or students at a college or university educational institution. A media professional is an individual who works in the journalism ecosystem. And so it was very specific beyond that. It was like, gosh, I think
It said something like crazy, like you will have earned 60% of your income from active journalism work or something like that,
yeah.
which I think like as we sit right now would like throw me out. I'm not like spending 60% of my time producing a story. I'm spending like 99.9% of my time and then some uh as an administrator of a news organization. So it's kind of really it locks out a lot of that upper level leadership that you would really want in a board.
Yeah. And then here, of course, you'll see the name change, which is right up front, up top. And then some other ones that I can remember off the top of my head because there was so much of this that we went through was there was a lot of language change in terms of board related either responsibilities or duties. I want to say there's something in here about the fundraising aspect. Thanks to Shirley, we revisited that and of course implemented that. Which one is it? It's somewhere in this one. Then there was another one about voting, like what happens when there's a tie of some sort. That's at the discretion now of the election committee, whereas before there wasn't something in place. So that was something that was also added. Let's see. I think there was discrepancies in the previous bylaws too about how many board members, like that's changed over time. So now that's consistent throughout these bylaws. So just kind of fixing some of the little things too that were in previous versions of this. Let's see, I'm trying to think of some more off the top of my head. Yeah. Well, I hope that answers your question, Melissa, but that is, I guess, one way to look at kind of how that's changed to be more inclusive. The other thing I will add is you will not see and hear anything related to chapters, because we have learned, and I think that was a big part of the holdup for the global committee, I want to say, or even a holdup in general of the bylaws, because there was a lot of back and forth that happened about how do chapters and kind of group associated members fit into this organization and into the bylaws. Well, we had gotten guidance from the lawyer that we were working with, this at least this last year under with this board, to really use or create, you can create those outside of the bylaws. And so I think the previous lawyer had said that they needed to be a part of the bylaws, but because we are not doing huge active work in that, it actually worked out that, you know, it's something that can be handled outside of the bylaws. And so, which I think is very appropriate in this case. So we decided not to try to push that, because essentially we just didn't know what we were going to do as an organization in terms of the chapters or whatever they're going to be called. It's not necessarily that we're not going to do them, it's just we should figure out what exactly they're going to be first. And we didn't have a ton of that information yet about what members wanted in that case. And so it just worked out that the lawyer happened to say that, well, they don't really have a place in the bylaws anyway. So, because I know, Melissa, we and I had talked about that at one point about chapters and things like that. So that's something else. But yeah. Any other questions? We're putting Melissa on the spot because she's the only attendee.
That's fine. That's fine. Happy to participate. Prompt discussion.
I guess I'm curious about, as a member, like as a voting member, if you don't mind me asking you a question about this. You know, what would it take to get members to be more involved in the bylaw process, like revising them, like you as a member, like how would we get you interested, or maybe if you wouldn't mind sharing like why this isn't something that you haven't already kind of jumped in on, if you will. That could give us some insight if you don't mind.
You're asking me to think through that?
Yeah,
so I will tell you, I do remember, and I couldn't tell you what year it was, but when I was early into the association, I do remember somebody suggesting, oh, the bylaws committee is looking for participation. So I remember being in a few meetings, but I also remember there was a great deal of like confusion and questions because there are, legalities around this. And so I think sometimes members think, well, this is more complicated than I'm prepared to be a part of, or I don't know enough to participate in this. But I think
Yeah.
the way you've been explaining it tonight, hopefully, as people listen to the recording of this, will understand that it really is just informing the future shape of the organization in a way that, as we talk about that institutional knowledge, so that there is less confusion, right, in these transition moments. And as the organization grows, that's what I think. I think it's people understanding in a more straightforward way why the bylaws are so important, and also understanding what they are in place to do.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. I appreciate that. I mean, I think that's an easy kind of assumption, is that they are rather intimidating. I'm not going to lie. I didn't not see myself on this committee 2 years ago, 3 years ago when I started on the board. So I totally get it. And so I guess that gives us a little bit of work on this committee to figure out how to kind of I guess, fill that gap, if you will, or bridge that gap, and make it more, I guess, less intimidating and more open to folks to want to jump in. It looks like we have another attendee, so I'm just gonna let folks know where we're at. We're in the Q&A phase. We started with, or the question, yeah, the Q&A phase. We started with just an overview of the previous bylaws, the current revised ones that are up for vote, and we're just kind of answering questions right now for anyone who has any.
Yeah, and we did unlock the attendee permissions to speak. So Luella and Melissa, if you'd like to say anything, you're welcome to make any comments. Thanks for joining us.
Luella, we were waiting for your very hard questions. Do you got any for us?
I didn't even get a chance to read the revised bylaws, so
We can give you a quicker version of the overview if you'd like.
just like any major changes.
Okay. I'm going to give you a little bit of my presentation first and then go into some of the changes. How about that? Let me find the documents here. So we just kind of put this quick little agenda together. We talked a little bit about kind of the big hard hitting questions that we kind of anticipated, like, why is this taking so long? If you're familiar, these are the kind of the three versions of the bylaws on the screen here. The first ones in 1983 that were the charter, and then 1995, which is the last time that they were visited or revised. And then now this year, the 2026, which is the one that's up for a vote at the conference this year. And really just kind of a mixture of things contributed to how long this has taken to get to this point, including just the nature of the board, kind of folks, how much work it entails for a voluntary board to kind of work through some of this, but also just the changes in the board over time. And then, of course, kind of it has been in the work, like it didn't just start last year or the year before. The revision process has actually started we can document it back to, or point it back to, like the early 2000s. And so, and then of course, just changes that happen along the way. And so lots of different reasons that it's taken us this long, and definitely goes beyond this board. This has started with previous boards. I think Rebecca said that as far back as she remembers is like 3 boards, previous boards. I don't know if that includes us or not. I'm going to say it probably beyond this current board. The other thing we wanted to mention was just that, it is because it was so long, or it's been so long since the last revision, the 1995, like 31 years. We were wanting to get this in members' hands, because I think this is going to be, I look at this as a continuously revising living document that's going to need to be revisited. And so it doesn't just stop here with this vote. We are looking at beyond the vote, depending on what happens there. What are we going to do to ensure that we don't end up spending another 20, 30 years trying to revise these? Like maybe we're thinking of, in the elections and governance committee, of creating some kind of a policy or process that kind of says, this is when this committee needs to be revising these. This is, maybe we'll align it with the strategic planning. We haven't gotten that far yet, but those are things that we're thinking about, and trying to make sure that we're not going to wait another how many decades to update these bylaws. And of course, as you can imagine, 1995 was a much different time, even though it was only feels like 10 years ago to Becca and some of us in here. It was quite a bit of a different time for journalism, for Native journalists, for, just the whole landscape. And so really updating that language to reflect kind of what's happening now, what are the needs of this organization, and what can help this board continue to govern its members. So some big changes. I think one of the ones we mentioned to an earlier question about inclusivity was, I'm flipping through all of them. if you just look at it, you can see how much more detailed it is. So let me go back here. This is the 1995 version of that. And it has some specifics in there, but I think this new version really goes into the nitty gritty of it, as you will see here. So that's the 1995 version. And if you look at the one today, it's got a whole table of contents that's a couple of pages, and then it goes into all of the specifications. Like one big one here is obviously the name change. This is now going to be reflected in the new bylaws, or the revised bylaws. It's got information about the organization in terms of a corporation, which I don't think it had before. It's got more inclusive language about what it means to be a media professional and who's included in that, because we recognize that the landscape has changed, but also our members' interest in journalism has shifted a little bit, in the sense of like they might be in journalism in some ways that are not traditional journalism roles in a lot of cases. Angel mentioned that I think at some point this said like so much percentage of the work that you do had to accumulate like income, like so much of your income had to be as a working journalist. And so that is no longer part of that. So here again, becoming more inclusive. It's got more information, specific information about what members kind of members' rights, kind of what their responsibility is or roles within their organization itself. Other things like, I guess, who, I know there was a lot of changes with the board itself. So, like here, there's new information here about fundraising and kind of the board's responsibility in that, which is a huge one. Also, the makeup of the board, like how many we're talking about. There were inconsistencies in the previous bylaws. So just really, in my opinion, very specific things. There was also references in the other version of the bylaws for things that didn't exist. They may have existed at that time, but there was like some kind of a handbook or something that was referenced in there that we don't even have that or use it. And so those are some things that we also took out, and they're no longer reflected here because they are not part of it. The other thing I will say that is less like obvious is the way that the language is in, I think these revised bylaws are more, what's the word, like forgiving, if you will. So, because we've learned over time that the bylaws should really be more zoomed out than super specific, because they cover a number of things over time. And most of that specific work that one would want to put in the bylaws, those can be done within the organization, within the committees themselves, through policy, through processes and procedures, things like that. Those, and I think this is very much reflective of that. It's more of like it's specific, but it's still kind of an overview. So it gives us the flexibility to do some things that are not necessarily, what's the word? Very specifically outlined within the bylaws.
So it's like more big picture guidelines.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. It's funny to say that, because I'm also saying it's very specific, because it does the big picture stuff, but it also helps us answer questions we also didn't have answers to before. Because a lot of the times, I mean, I can even tell you in my role just this last year as president, there's lots of questions I've had of like, so how do we do this? And a lot of, rightfully so, the answer would be, well, what did the bylaws say? And when I look at those 1995 bylaws, there's not a lot of guidance to tell me how to do X, Y, Z, or to tell us how to do X, Y, Z. Now, this is a little bit more intricate so that we have some guidance. And so I think that that's really what it does. I'm thinking of anything else. And again, those who have, if I'm missing something, please let me know, because I do want to reiterate that this board alone is not fully responsible for these revisions. Like, this is the work of boards going back almost what, 20 years or something when these revisions initially started. So those are the ones offhand that I can think of in terms of like some of the big changes. But in reality, all of it is really the big changes. So yeah, I mean, we could, if you just took a look at them side by side, you'll definitely see a lot of those big changes in every section, I would even argue. So hopefully that gives you a rundown and a kind of a sense of how we got to this point.
Yeah, it feels like the changes were needed. Like
Yeah,
it
for
feels like
sure.
we were flying blind.
It does. And I think there are definitely, the other thing I would say is like there are definitely areas where, I'm more than certain that members are going to say, well, what about this? And that's great. And but that's exactly why we really want members to join the committee and to find those areas that might be missing. For the large part, I can tell you, at least within the last year, it's just been Angel Ellis and I hacking this out, working with the lawyers. But having members have an eye on this and to give some feedback, that's really what we're going to hope to get in the next, at least between now and the next strategic planning, because we need that. And the other thing I should say is that in our existing bylaws, it does not say that the board or the committee needs to give members an opportunity to provide feedback. And so that's also something to keep in mind, because we anticipated some members saying, well, when are we going to be able to put some feedback in, and then when are we going to see those changes being made? Well, that doesn't exist. And so what our goal here is in this committee is to create that using policy or policy procedure or whatever the fancy name is we'll use for that, so that in the future we're not waiting another 20 something years for the revisions to happen. We want them to be kind of happen in sync with strategic planning. And so that's something, a next project for Angel and I on this committee to figure out, like, what is that timeline going to look like, and what is the format of that? How will we carry that out when we do give it to members? But right now we're just trying to get something established, since nothing has been since 1995. So, but those are kind of the next steps we have.
And so bylaws and then board policy and procedure are different documents, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Angel is our policy queen, so I'm going to let you, Angel, if you don't mind, talk a little bit about that, the differences. And I've just been talking for too long.
Well, I can just kind of like speak to it in terms of like my experience on the board the last several years. When I first started, it was kind of like we had I had no clue how to get things done. Like I just didn't know how processes flowed. And so what we're building in terms of policy and procedure for the board itself is kind of, who's the person steering the board? Well, that's the president. And how does the work flow? Well, that work flows from the strategic plan. And then we filter those goals and activities that we need to do into the proper committee. And that committee is ideally made up of, the members and a board member. And that's how work gets done. And so that really just was kind of not defined anywhere at all. And how often we check in, um, how we track say I'm sitting on a committee and I have a project that all the members say they want to do, but there's no funding for it. Well, how do I request that funding? How does that get allocated? And how does the board, manage things like from that perspective? So we're kind of working on updating those foundational workflows,
Okay.
um, so that that's consistent in a handoff period. Because it
Yeah.
kind of seems like every time the board changes, somebody who's termed out was really leading a charge somewhere, and then that ball gets dropped and never picked up again, or at least not picked up with the same kind of vision for it. That
Yeah.
seems to have slowed us down a lot, and it kept work from, getting done. And I even know that it probably became frustrating for staff at some points because things they had questions about and guidances they needed just weren't happening at some point, you know.
Yeah, I get that.
So
All right, cool.
we're cracking the whip.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to give I was looking for a specific example. So to give you an example, Luella, there's language we added. I remember this because it was one of the last things that we added at the end before getting it approved by the board, was about elections and what happens when there's a tie. And so instead of kind of prescribing what happens when there's a tie, because the tie could look a number of different ways, like that it won't always be the same kind of tie. So in the bylaws we put, it's at the discrepancy of the governance and elections committee to figure out what to do with that tie. And so that's an example of like, so we will now create that policy for, at least for this board, what that will look like. Because I don't know when these will be changed again, but that's an example of like taking a part of that, the language in the bylaws, and then creating policy and procedure for, to make it more specific or to have more guidance on that. So that was something that I know that we had put in there. So now it is up to this committee to figure out what will that look like if there is a tie. And so so I hope that gives you a little bit of a sense of like kind of the differences.
Fight
Yeah.
for death. No, just
Yeah,
kidding.
for sure.
We'll sort it out with knives. No.
Yeah. Like wrestling.
thumb wrestling, whatever you guys, whatever the committee decides. Yeah.
Rock, paper, scissors.
Yeah. But we're really excited about this. You know, and I hope members are too. And I just I hope that it encourages members when they're seeing things in it that they're like, wait, what about this? You know, we're happy to answer any questions. If you run across folks and they're just like, you know, they've got questions, send them our way. We're happy to answer any questions and reiterate a lot of the stuff that we've mentioned here. So we understand that folks might have a lot of these same questions. So, but yeah, that's our overview, our presentation, and happy to answer any other questions if there's some, but it looks like otherwise we're coming up on time. Cool. Well, thank you for joining us, and those who are watching this and weren't able to be here, please feel free to reach out to the Governance and Elections Committee if you have questions that were not brought up here, or just anything at all that we can answer in relation to the bylaws. Angel Ellis is on the committee, as well as myself. And so we'll be around at conference. So if you've got questions between now and then, either send us an email to committees@indigenousjournalists.org, or I'm sure you can find us somehow, or in person at the conference. Just pull us aside. So I think that's it. So thanks, Melissa and Luella, for coming. Appreciate you all, and staff for supporting and helping us do this work. The staff is a huge part of this, so appreciate you all. Great. Any last words, Angel, as my co-pilot?
Not really. Just also just emphasizing, you know, we got like federal government that wants to just turn every nonprofit into what they consider Antifa. And so the more we can shore up our bylaws and modernize it to, you know, we had a lawyer look at it and they think that there's some components in there that really need to be there for safety and continuance. I feel like that's probably important at this time.
Yep. Great. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you all, and have a good night. Have a good week. See you at conference.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.